Wundt said, impossible to study experimentally. Vygotsky said, why? It is possible to study experimentally.
Okay, here we are again. Nice to see you, Nikolai.
Nice to see you, Anthony.
This is great. I'm really looking forward to our chat tonight. We're going to mostly pick up where we left off in our first conversation, but do things slightly differently. I'm going to try to be a little more focused this time. So I have the same target audience in mind as last time, and that's pretty much anybody who's looking to better understand Vygotsky's theory, or looking to experiment with it or try it out. For instance, perhaps as a teacher or as a coach. Anybody who's just looking to expand their repertoire and add a little bit of Vygotsky to whatever they're already doing and enjoying. And anybody interested in helping others develop. So let's get to the great puzzle. Here's a little bit of what I understand is the following, and I am not a psychologist. I didn't study psychology. I'm just trying to learn.
Yeah.
I learned that Wilhelm Wundt was the first person, I believe, to make a huge breakthrough by separating lower mental functions from higher mental functions, which is basically the mental functions that an animal might have, or the animal part of ourselves from the actual human part. And he said the problem is that you can't test the higher mental functions. You can test in a lab setting the lower. Vygotsky set himself out to solve that problem and basically kind of discover like how we actually become human. So if that's at all remotely accurate, I would like to pass the microphone to you, maybe to tell us a little bit about the story. Did he actually succeed in solving that puzzle?
It's very nice beginning. It's very nice introduction to the discussion. And again, I want to thank you for the opportunity for this project. And I think it's very, very important. And really, what you are doing, I find it absolutely amazing. It's not because you invited me, so it's because the idea to introduce Vygotsky's conception and Vygotsky's theory to the bigger audience of teachers, parents, early career researchers, PhD students, for, as you said, everybody who wants to know more and to understand deeper what cultural historical theory is about, and how we can use these to improve our understanding of human development. Right. So, and I'm so happy that you started from Wilhelm Wundt, because that's important. Every time we think about a theory, we have to identify, we have to allocate the theory into the historical context and the historical content. And the historical context of the time when Vygotsky started to develop this theory can be characterized by two important things. The first is, it was a time of the crisis in psychology. The crisis in psychology started in the beginning of 20th century. Psychology as a scientific discipline, as a science, have found itself in a state of the crisis. And by the way, I should say, even now, even recently, nowadays, psychology still is in a situation of the permanent crisis. And the only difference is that now this is a permanent crisis. And psychology used to live in the situation of the crisis, and I see that nobody pays attention anymore. So, but at that time, in 20s, 30s, last year, if you look on, if you look at publications of all key main psychologists like Wilhelm Wundt, and many others, they were all speaking about crisis in psychology. They were all trying to find a way how to overcome the crisis, how to make psychology a scientific discipline, natural science, based on the experimental principles, the same as physics, biology, chemistry. And why that crisis happened? What's the reason for that crisis? What's the idea? What's the reason for the crisis? This is quite clear. Psychology, by definition, should be a science of human psyche, human mind, human consciousness, whatever. You can call it mind, consciousness, psyche, whatever. But by definition, these things are subjective. They are subjective phenomena. They exist in our mental life. They are mental constructs, mental things.
It's not.
They are yeah.
It's not quite as easy as like dissecting a frog. Yeah.
Yes. And but to be a science, psychology should have a objective method.
Mm.
But it leads to the paradox. How can we study subjective phenomena using objective method? And Immanuel Kant, one of the greatest philosophers in the world, Immanuel Kant, he even said that psychology as a science is impossible because the subject matter is subjective, and science should be the way to study things which are outside human's mind. Okay. Using human's mind to study objects, processes which are outside. But if you try to apply these methods to study the consciousness, because there is no sense in that, because it's like to use the tools to study the same tool.
Yeah.
Okay.
Like mind reading.
And that was the kind of problem, and this problem still exists. It's not solved. And Vygotsky was involved in that great discussions, not only in Russia. It was in Europe, in US, and many others. And you see that there were different suggestions how to overcome the crisis. For example, behaviorism. Behaviorists said that we cannot study mind because mind is subjective, but what we can study objectively observable behavior. And through studying objectively existing observable behavior, we can make any suggestions or hypotheses or assumptions about how the mind works, especially when the subject has one behavior, then something happens in his or her mind, and then the behavior changes. So this is an obvious indication of the work of mental processes. That was one of the solutions suggested to the science, how to overcome the problem, to make psychology the objective science. And the second solution, now I'm coming to Wundt. I'm sorry, I don't want this to be a lecture of the history of psychology.
This is great. I think we're trying to talk about how to see the invisible.
And the solution Wundt suggested was very interesting. Wilhelm Wundt was the father of contemporary psychology, but to be exact, we have to say that Wilhelm Wundt was the father of contemporary experimental psychology. because he established the first psychological laboratory in Leipzig in 1879. So, and this laboratory was about to study the simplest psychological processes like sensation, perception, eye movements, hearing, all the things. And his contribution to the psychological theory was that he divided Wundt, divided all psychological functions and processes into two groups. The first group he called natural or elementary psychological functions. And I don't think the word elementary is correct, because if you look if you look at these processes, you will find that they are very complex. For example, vision is not an elementary, because there are lots of processes involved. But the terminology on natural psychological functions, and
it seems like natural is a better term, because you don't really develop your vision, right? That's something you develop.
But I think some people will disagree with you, because even vision develops. But however, the second group of processes of psychological functions Wundt introduced were the so-called higher psychological functions. And higher psychological functions are functions which human beings have. Animals have elementary psychophysiological functions or natural functions, and some animals have even much more developed senses than we have. We do. For example, dogs have much better function of smelling than we, and cats can see in the darkness, so their senses are much more developed than us. So, and the second group of functions is what Wundt defined, determined as higher psychological functions, which are, as he said, only in humans. For example,
only humans.
Only humans. For
example, I have some good questions lined up.
Yeah. About that. You can, of course, we can argue that. But don't forget, we are speaking about 1879.
Okay.
So we are speaking about those times. When there were no zoopsychology, when there were no tomographs, there was not too much research about them. So, look, we are locating Vygotsky in the historical context.
Excellent. Yeah.
So in that context, not in our context. From our perspective, it might look outdated, but so higher psychological functions are the functions which we can find only in humans. For example, logical memory. What does it mean, logical memory? It means that sometimes humans are using some objects as tools which help them to remember. For example, they make cuts on the trees, or they make notes. So it's the higher psychological function of memory.
Let me ask you a very quick question.
Of course.
I'm going to ask a bunch of dumb questions, right? First one is, once you develop, what's that in your hand?
Oh, nothing.
Once you develop logical memory, for example, that's not something you develop once, right? That sort of develops and develops and develops throughout your life. Is that correct? It's not like you cross the threshold and then you have it, right?
No.
Just wanted to clarify that.
You can develop your logical memory by using different system of tools. Okay, for example, I can make notes in Russian, I can make notes in English. So, and then I'm using the same memory of mine, but I'm using different system of signs depending on when I. So, and then you can, for example, learn traffic signs when you have an idea to to learn how to drive a car. You have to develop your memory by looking on the traffic signs and remember all of them, what they all mean. Like what this sign means, 60, or don't turn left, or don't overtake, something like that. So you see, there is no limits for developing the cultural memory, but biological memory, natural memory is limited. So of course, some animals have quite long memory. They can remember things much longer than we. But it's the same story as cats can see in the darkness. But what cats cannot see, cats cannot find any logic or any logic in a text which is in front of our eyes.
Okay.
So things like that. So
can you just give us maybe like one or two more higher psychological function examples?
Okay. So first of all, voluntary attention. Voluntary attention. We all have involuntary attention. When something happens outside, some noise.
Yeah.
Okay, I react immediately. This is the example of involuntary attention. Something brings my attention involuntary. I have no intention. I'm not doing it consciously with the aim, with the goal to focus my attention. Something happens, okay, and I turn. So this is, but what is voluntary attention? Voluntary attention is my ability to remain concentrated on something or somebody with the aim, with the goal to keep focused, to stay focused for quite a long time. So
and everybody has the ability to improve that skill. Okay.
Yes, everybody. Okay. Yeah,
to different degrees, yes or no?
Of course, to different degrees, and this is
even me. Okay, so there's hope.
Even you, everybody, and it's one of the interesting applications of Vygotsky theory. But we are not in Vygotsky theory by now. We are in Wundt's. But if you ask Wundt, is it possible to develop this? Wundt might say, I don't know. Okay. So I'm sorry for keeping you all the time in the context, but we had an agreement that we stay there. So voluntary attention. Okay, then logical memory, then abstract thinking or thinking with concepts. Okay, some animals have very high level of thinking, but all their thinking is in a very concrete situation. They can solve problems, but they can solve very concrete problems. Human beings, we do have science. We are using scientific concepts. We have philosophy. We have such kind of things. We can discuss absolutely abstract or not abstract, very important questions like the tension between US and Iran. Yeah, because we know about that through the technologies, and we have our opinions about that. But can you imagine chimpanzees discussing this?
Yeah.
Of course not. Okay.
And for the
but they are very intellectual apes, of course. So you see. So
and for the record on that topic, the U.S.-Iran topic, I have laid out a series of predictions so far, and most of them have been right on the money. So that suggests that not totally lost, but hopefully it stays that way.
And this moves us to one more high psychological function, which is called imagination. Imagination, cultural imagination, as Wundt identified. So we can imagine things which do not exist at all. Coming back, imagine all the people living for, you might say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. You see, we can imagine people live in peace. So can you imagine this? Yes. But one day, all people live in peace never happened in the history of the mankind.
Yeah.
Okay, so these are high psychological functions. And why Wundt separated these two things? The idea of Wundt was to develop psychology as an objective science. Do you remember? crisis, okay, how to make psychology an absolute science. And the answer from Wilhelm Wundt was very clear. He said, yes, we can make an experimental study of lower or natural psychological processes in the laboratory with a special equipment, and he developed some equipments to study senses, touching, hearing, seeing, others. But psychology cannot study experimentally the higher psychological functions, because first of all, they are very complex, and they are not combinations. They are not the result of the development of the lower ones. They are something which is very special. And
did he see them as something separate?
Yes.
And special. So he didn't see higher sitting atop lower, correct?
No, he said they are staying on the top, but he said that they are not the results of development of the lower functions. So, so they are not improved lower functions, so to say. So they are something which is different.
Got it.
And he suggested that the only way to study these high psychological functions is to do it through analysis of cultural artifacts, like mythology of these people, traditions, cultures, everyday practices, religious forms of interaction, something like that. And he wrote, first of all, he wrote several books on experimental psychology, how to study natural psychological functions. And at the same time, he wrote a book called the Volkspsychologie, the people's psychology, how to study high psychological functions through the analysis of their rituals, religious rituals, cultural practices, everyday activities, all the things. So, and so that's, he just was a founder of experimental psychology and cultural psychology, in the sense that, so that all started from. So in this context, crisis and two psychologies, Vygotsky started his work. That was the situation, that was the content. And his main contribution was that he suggested the way how to overcome the crisis. He suggested the way how to make psychology an objective science. And he suggested the method of experimental studying of higher psychological functions. Wundt said, impossible to study experimentally. Vygotsky said, why? It is possible to study experimentally, but of course, it should be a special type of experiment. It should be a different experiment, because the method of studying should correspond to the subject matter. You cannot look at stars using microscope. You need a telescope for that. So you cannot use to the molecules using telescope. You need a microscope for that. So Vygotsky said that the task was to develop, to introduce, and to test, to check, to test, to try to test a new research method to study higher psychological functions of human being. That was his task. So, and
I want to jump in very quickly. People like me who were trained during a time when Vygotsky was popular in schools of education associate Vygotsky with teaching, and we often are not aware that his work was, experimental research methods. His work was studying psychology, and the teaching world has sort of borrowed or appropriated some of his ideas. So it just, that's not something I knew the first time around.
Yeah. So, and yes, and for many people, it might be like you and many others, might be very interesting new new dimension of Vygotsky. Yes, everybody knows Vygotsky introduced, or he developed or created the cultural historical theory. But what is not less important is that together with developing a new theory, he also developed a new research method of researching the higher psychological functions as an answer to the situation of the crisis of psychology. And the crisis was rooted in the idea that how is it possible to study subjective phenomena using objective methods? So, and the place of Vygotsky in the history of psychology is about that. He was the name on the same level as Wilhelm Wundt, because Wundt suggested the problem and Vygotsky suggested the way how to resolve the problem. So they are,
and together they were able to address the crisis.
Yes, yes. So, and that's why it's so important to locate Vygotsky not on the empty space as if it was nothing, and then all of a sudden Vygotsky appeared, the genius created the theory. No, no, no. He was involved in the whole process of development, of dramatic and sometimes even tragical development of psychology as a very young science comparing to chemistry or physics, you know.